The babysitting conundrum. Susan at 15 was a professional babysitter. Susan was also a nerd or geek, whatever one you wanted to call her. She'd preferred neither but knew she was one. She'd never had a boy or girlfriend. She can't remember a time she even had friends. You see, Susan lived a very quiet life with her mother, who didn't let her enjoy extracurricular activities like the other kids at her school. Her mother wanted her to have an amazing education and get away from the small strange town of Black Bay. So Susan studied, wrote fanfic, played video games, and loved horror comics. She babysat for $15 an hour but was considered the best babysitter in town. Every week she had at least 5 babysitting jobs. Monday was the Carters, as they had Dart League from 8 till 11. Wednesday was the Monteiths, for their dance class from 7 until 10. Thursdays and Fridays were the Thompsons, for karaoke nights from 8 until whenever they stumbled through their door. But Saturdays were for the dormers to escape their children. The dormers' children, Jessica and Stephen, ages 9 and 6, were evil children, who didn't listen, and who argued at every chance with Susan. Who once told Susan that the dog had gotten out and locked Susan out of the house without her phone. Susan, who'd stood outside for 3 hours cold and wet waiting until Mr. and Mrs. Dormer arrived back home. They'd apologized profusely and paid Susan an extra $50 just to continue babysitting. This time though, Susan had an idea. Saturday would be Halloween and she'd told the dormers she'd take the kids trick-or-treating. It was at this time Susan started making a plan. She wanted to get back at those 2 evil children. Jessica and Stephen, with their blonde hair and blue eyes, were almost cherub-like. But demons were what they were. First, she'd take them trick-or-treating as promised. But she was going to ensure they ended up back at La Grande Estate. It was quite a walk from the dormers, but worse came to worse, she'd call a cab for herself and the kids. La Grande Estate was once a big beautiful mansion, lined with 20-foot hedges and steel gates. Its once glorious grounds are now covered in weeds and ivy. Its beautiful white siding is now colored brown from dirt and grime. Its huge bay windows are smashed and broken now. Susan couldn't wait to get there and try and scare these kids straight. Susan picked the kids up straight after school and walked them to their house. Mr. and Mrs. Dormer are putting on long black robes, and some form of red mask. She didn't recognize the masks, only that they were homemade. Mr. Dormer was whispering something to Stephen, but Susan couldn't make out what they were saying. Stephen ran back into the room, with a wide smile on his face. He stood and stared at Susan, looking past her face deep into her eyes. His smile turned to an evil sneer, as he turned and skipped away to his room. 10 minutes later, Jessica and Stephen were sitting on the living room floor with their costumes on. Jessica was dressed as one of the Disney princesses, and Stephen was Iron Man. Mr. and Mrs. Dormer told Susan they'd be later tonight. Probably after 3 a.m., but they'd get her home when they were finished. Susan told them that was fine and got the kids ready to leave. It was 6 p.m. when Susan and the 2 children left. For once the kids were ridiculously well behaved. They'd held hands everywhere they went, no arguing, no fits, no mean tricks. Susan almost felt bad about the mean trick she was going to pull on them. As it got later in the evening, Susan walked the children towards La Grande's estate. The children laughed and giggled the closer they got to the property. They walked along the overgrown hedgerow and made their way towards the gate. Susan started telling the children a scary story about the old man who used to steal bad kids from the town that lived there. Stephen turned and laughed at her, as Jessica hushed him. Stephen stopped laughing as they reached the gate. The large house rested against a disappearing red sky behind it. Susan swore she could hear people talking coming from the yard, and again had second thoughts about this. She took her phone out to take a pic of the house, and when she finished digging through her bag, she looked up and the children were on the other side of the gate heading up the drive. She yelled for the kids to wait for her, as she pushed her way through the crack in the large iron gate. Her leggings caught on a chunk of metal, tearing them, and cutting her leg. Susan cried out again for the kids, but neither Stephen nor Jessica turned around, instead continuing towards the dark house. The voices got louder as they got nearer. Susan wrapped her hand around her leg, checking the cut. It was quite deep, and dark red blood flowed from it, staining her beige leggings. Limping towards the house, she called out for the kids, but they'd gotten too far away from her and were disappearing in the light of the setting sun. Susan felt sick to her stomach and wondered how much trouble she'd be in for losing these two little monsters. She watched as their silhouettes vanished behind the house. Susan hurried along as best she could. When she turned the corner of the house, the kids were sitting on an old cement bench, throwing rocks into a shallow dirty pond. Stephen turned and looked into Susan's eyes again, that same evil grin crossing his face, then darkness. Susan was awoken by a terrible smell. She knew it was ammonia salts from chemistry class. Susan couldn't move her arms or legs. She'd been bound at the wrists and ankles. 5 large fires were burning in a ring around the spot on the ground Susan had been tied to. The back of her head felt horrible and wet. Her long dirty blonde hair splayed around her head, was covered in her deep red blood. Susan screamed when she saw the blood, and in the darkness, she heard someone say she was awake. 20 to 30 people encircled her, all dressed as Mr. and Mrs. Dormer were, in dark robes with homemade masks. They took each other's hands and began chanting in Latin. Susan, of course being the nerd she was, actually knew a bit of what they were saying, and because of the comics she read she figured this was some kind of ceremony. Susan begged for her captors to release her and she wouldn't say anything to anyone. She just wants to get Stephen and Jessica home. Stephen and Jessica stepped towards her, and both began chanting the same thing the adults were. The chanting Susan thought to herself, what are they saying? Enter this body and something. Be free. Enter this body and be free, is what they were saying. At first, Susan felt a warming sensation on her inner thighs, slowly moving up towards her midriff. Then the tingling started, like her whole body had fallen asleep but she was still wide awake. Stephen turned towards a large individual standing behind him. The tall individual bent over, and Stephen whispered something in their ear. The person Susan now knew was Stephen's father. He leaned forward and checked Susan's head where her wound was. It was at this point Susan realized it didn't hurt anymore. Whoa everyone. Okay, we're going to try and take this from the top. The little cut she had on her head has stopped bleeding, so someone gets me the fake blood and we'll try with that, Stevens's father announced to the crowd. Susan heard voices she knew in the crowd. They were all people she knew. Then she looked past the fires and saw the people with their cameras out filming the whole thing. Susan's mother came walking out of the shadows. I'm sorry, Susan. We had to make the film look as real as possible. You had to think you were in real danger, so we'd win the indie film horror contest. Susan's tears stung her eyes as they dripped down her blood-stained cheeks. She was more confused than anything, but that confusion quickly turned to anger knowing that her mother would put her through something like this. She started feeling that same tingling moving up her body, and a voice entered her mind, are you going to let them hold us here? Susan had the overwhelming urge to break free and do harm to her captors. Her blood boiled in her veins. She felt a strength in her body she'd never felt before. Give me control and I'll make them all pay for what they have done to you, the voice in her mind said. The people who'd done this to Susan milled around talking amongst themselves, setting up cameras in different positions, laughing and joking about what they were going to do with the prize money. None of them noticed Susan talking to herself. Okay. I give you control. I want revenge, Susan said to the voice in her head. Lightning rolled and crashed across the sky. The small fires set around Susan grew in size and heat. That's it. That's exactly the shot we need, Mr. Dormer exclaimed, everyone back into position. Okay, Susan, it's just a bit longer. We only need 1 or 2 shots to finish the film, Susan's mother stated, hovering over her and smiling. Susan smiled back at her mother, but in the darkness, Susan's mother couldn't see how black her eyes had become. Her mother stood up and joined the circle with the others as they began chanting again. As the group repeated the words as before, Susan's body writhed and twisted. She began repeating the chant along with the group. Her tears turned to blood as they dripped from her eyes, hissing as they hit the ground. Mr. Dormer took a plastic fake blade from his cloak and stepped toward Susan's body. He raised the fake blade above his head and drove it into Susan's chest. Susan's back arched, almost folding her in half, as a pool of blood dripped from where the blade had pierced her. She turned her head towards Mr. Dormer, her black eyes staring into his soul. "Thank you, Ted, for freeing me." The ropes that once bound Susan now lay torn on the ground. Susan stood and removed a now metal blade from her chest. The wound healed instantly, and she leapt at Mr. Dormer, driving the blade into his neck. Mr. Dormer, who stood a full foot taller than Susan, was now being held up by the blade in his neck in Susan's one hand. The group continued chanting as they thought this was only part of the movie. Susan twisted the blade as Mr. Dormer spat blood into her face. Susan licked at it and laughed. But the laugh was not long-lived, as it turned into an ear-piercing scream. Everyone who had been chanting instantly dropped to their knees, crying in agony. "My name is Lucifer, the fallen star, and I wish to thank you for giving me this vessel on this holy night," Susan stated, but it was not her voice. It was the voice of a million souls all speaking at once. Her body, now twisted and deformed, walked slowly from person to person. She would whisper something to each one and then drive the dagger into their bodies, leaving them to bleed out where they lay. When she got to the children, not a word was said. She drove the blade in deep and fast, laughing maniacally as she did so. Her mother was last. As Susan walked towards her, Susan raised her hand, forcing her mother to stand and look her in the eye. "Please, Susan, don't do this. It was a joke. We just wanted to win some money. You would have gotten your share." Susan's mother pleaded with her to stop. Susan stood in front of her mother. Leaning in, she licked her mother from the nape of her neck to her earlobe. I love that taste. Fear, you humans all secreted, and it makes the meat that much more delicious." Susan smiled as she again looked into her mother's eyes. "By the way, Janice, Susan's not here anymore." Susan drove the blade into her mother's stomach, slicing her from the pelvis to the rib cage as her entrails fell at Susan's feet. Susan put the blade to her lips and licked it clean. Walking over to the camera closest to where she was tied, Susan looked into the lens. "I am here now, my children, thanks to these foolish humans." Susan stopped the video as she hit share to all social media button on the screen. By the next day, the short film had over 1 billion views. The bodies were discovered the next morning by local police. Susan is still at large and hasn't been seen since. Why I don't babysit for people outside my family? When I was around 15, I started babysitting a family with 3 kids. 2 boys, 1 girl. Their mom knew me as the oldest was friends with my little brother and had asked my mom if I could help out just because she had started taking on more shifts and her husband was doing the same. They lived right next to my high school and paid well, so I agreed despite not having that much experience. Pretty quickly I realized that it was going to be difficult. The kids were great, but I was nervous around them. The oldest was fine, just played on his Xbox most of the time or did homework, but the 2 youngest were a different story. The middle child, the daughter, was completely obsessed with horror movies, and on more than one occasion I had to hide the knives from her since she wanted to reenact them, and the youngest son tried to set fire to the Christmas tree. I know what kids can be like since I have a lot of younger and older cousins, but these drove me insane and I would constantly worry about them hurting themselves or each other. If they played up, I would threaten to call their mom, which normally would work. It was after a few months that I realized if I had mentioned the dad, that's when they would just behave and do what I had asked, so that's what I started doing. Now, I never really ever met the dad. I just knew that the guy was tall and big built, but was always described to me as still being nice, so I never thought about it. On this occasion, I had said to the youngest boy that I would call his dad if he didn't stop behaving, which resulted in a huge tantrum, so I ended up calling him and explaining. Luckily for me, the dad was getting off work early, so he said that he would get home as quickly as he could and apologize for the kid's behavior. When I explained this, the kid was sobbing and ended up locking himself in his room. That day, the dad got home and they weren't joking when they said he was tall. I'm only 5 feet 3 inches and was 15. When I saw him having to crouch a little to get through the door because of his size, I remember thinking, oh shit, no wonder the kids won't misbehave when he's there. I said hi and apologized for the work call, which he just brushed off and said that it needed to be done and not to worry. We were both sat on the couch. I can't remember why, but I think we were talking about what days they needed me for. Now, at this stage, the two youngest had gone outside to play while I was in with the oldest, as I had just been tidying a little from dinner. I was pretty weirded out because his oldest started to get pretty antsy when asked to go to the shop, and kept making excuses to his dad, so I had just offered to go. I could see the dad visibly frustrated and just wanted to defuse the situation. Now, I would like to point out that everything seemed normal at this point, but I remember feeling intimidated by the dad. I had only met him this one time and spoke for no more than 20 minutes. It turns out that the oldest had said to his mom that he didn't want me left alone with his dad, as he had been watching me a little too closely during our short encounter. The parents had asked me to babysit later on in that week, which I had agreed to. However, in the space of a few days, that quickly changed. I got a text from mom apologizing for the last-minute arrangements but saying I couldn't babysit. I was a little agitated since I had changed plans, but wasn't too bothered and just said it was fine and just let me know when she needed me. She had asked me to come around to get my pay for the last 2 weeks, and I decided to just nip around before going home. As soon as I was in the house, I could tell something was off, but not wanting to pry, I just went in to say hi, talked about books for a little bit, and left. It wasn't until the next week, I think, or the week after that, that everything kicked off. I came home to my mom being upset and angry, pacing the living room while my stepdad was trying to calm her down. I immediately went to her asking what was wrong, feeling a little worried. Instantly, she just threw her arms around me and started crying and holding me. I had meant to be babysitting, but again, got cancelled, so I was home earlier than I had said originally. Pulling away confused, I asked her what was wrong again. Turns out, my mom had been trying to get a hold of me, but my phone had died. I had gone to babysit and nobody was home, so I just decided to head back on the bus, but wasn't able to let my mom know. She sat me down and started trying to ask me questions about the dad and my time babysitting. Confused, I had mentioned that I had only met him once and only really spoke to him on the phone a handful of times when the kids were acting up. Nodding, my mom started pressing on and asked if anything else had happened and kept questioning me, saying I could tell her anything. I just looked at her confused and told them that nothing had happened and asked what this was all about. I always remember her taking a deep breath and saying, "Oh, thank God," before letting me know what happened. Now, as I said, the details are vague because this was on the news. Turns out, the guy had killed someone while working and been taken in by the police. During interrogation, it turns out that he admitted to beating his wife, and there were speculations of assaults. There was also mention that one of his types was petite girls that had dark hair, which happened to match my description at the time, and my mom was terrified in case something had happened. I'm turning 23 years old this year, and it still gives me shivers. I remember feeling like I was going to throw up and had a sinking feeling in my stomach. My mom held me close, crying because she had worried sick all day and was scared in case something had happened. Needless to say, I stopped babysitting for the family right there and then. I had felt so awful for the wife, as she was honestly one of the nicest women I had ever met. About a week later, I got a text from her. As it turns out, I had left some books, so I had said I would go get them after the phone. When I saw her, my heart sank. She had not slept and was putting on a brave face for the kids who weren't sure what was going on. We ended up sitting in the kitchen and I hugged her, just trying to comfort her. I had mentioned that if she needed help with the kids since he was gone, I would try and help, but she immediately refused. As it turned out, people had started attacking the house. She gave me my stuff, paid for the wages with a little more added. I had completely forgotten, and said she appreciated it, but it would be better if I just took a step back from the family, as she didn't want me getting hurt for being associated with them. To this day, I still think about them, and it still scares me to think about what could have happened. I still talk to the younger kids who are a lot older and even help tutor the younger girl. I helped the oldest when he started high school because I noticed the kids bullying him for what his dad had done, which was awful considering it wasn't the fault of the family. My first babysitting gig and the worst fear I've ever felt. I grew up in a really safe city in the Midwest, in an even safer neighborhood sort of set back in the woods and separated from the main part of town. I haven't had a lot of creepy encounters in my short life, knock on wood, so this is pretty much the most afraid I've ever been. I was 11 at the time and had just passed a CPR/babysitting essentials course at the rec. My neighborhood was very close-knit, all of the kids on my street played together, and because of my 2 younger brothers I would soon become the automatic babysitter for the 3 families we lived closest to. I'd looked after my brothers for short amounts of time, but this was my first job as a real babysitter, watching the 2 grade school-aged children who lived across the street. They were family friends, the parents had promised they'd be home by 11 p.m., and I knew that my parents were home and ready to step in if I needed anything, so I was a little nervous but felt like I had things under control. The kids were a novice babysitter's dream. They'd been trained that they were only allowed to choose 1 treat each before bed, and actually refused my offer to let them finish the show we were watching because it was their bedtime and they still needed to brush their teeth first. I was floored, but it made my job super easy, so I tucked them in and headed back downstairs to watch TV until their parents returned. The mom is an interior designer, so their house is spacious and absolutely beautiful. Their living room is at the back of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows and great views of the woods in their backyard. The couch is set up with its back to those windows, and I was watching TV with their elderly white lab, Alex. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something large and light-colored brush past the window behind me. I thought it might just be a deer, but I was 11 and alone and I have an active imagination, so I began to feel uneasy and pretty on edge. The parents weren't due back for another 2 hours, so I walked into the kitchen to call my mom and dad for reassurance. Alex followed. Their kitchen faces the living room, with the house phone on the counter. This was before cell phones happened. Standing at the counter dialing my parents, I had a clear view through the broad archway into the living room and out those enormous windows into the backyard. Alex laid down at my feet as I stood next to the counter and told my mom that I thought I'd seen something out the window. Hearing her voice was as comforting and reassuring as I thought it would be, so I told her that, no, I didn't need Dad to come over, and that, yes, I'd call her if I needed anything at all. I hung up the phone and sat down on the floor to rub Alex's ears and belly for a few minutes, still kind of wary of the living room. I hadn't been there too long before I caught a glimpse of something odd outside those giant windows. I looked harder, past the glare of the TV, and noticed a tiny light bobbing around in the woods. Probably just a neighbor, I thought. But as I watched, the light seemed to be moving in what was undeniably my direction. My whole body froze and I stared as the light got closer and closer to the living room windows, and at some point, I realized, with complete and paralyzing horror, that the light had grown large enough that the source had to be right outside the house. The beam swung from one side of the living room to the other and then settled directly on my face. I don't even think I squinted in the bright light as it shone through the window into my eyes. I was too startled. Alex snoozed on, placid in his old age and entirely unaware that my heart had pretty much stopped beating. The light moved again, this time swinging away to illuminate a face from underneath. I saw dark, hollow eye sockets and the glowing curves of someone's cheeks, but the face's details were lost in the harsh angle of the flashlight's beam. At this point, I was trying with all my might to scream or to move my fingers enough to dial 911, or to move out of view of the window. Literally anything would have been better than sitting there with my mouth open and tears in my eyes like a stuffed turkey. But I'd never felt this kind of icy terror before and was completely immobilized by it. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, and I was totally powerless. The light swung around to point at me, then quickly moved back underneath the horrible face outside. It repeated this pattern once or twice, and then it suddenly disappeared. The flashlight had been turned off, and for whatever reason that was enough to finally let me move again. I quickly stood, and hit dial, about to call 911 as I mentally debated whether to hole up in the master bedroom with the children or just grab them and try to run out the front door to my parents' house. The rec class had not prepared me for this. Before I even got as far as the foyer and the first one, though, I heard a loud boom and felt my gut leap into my throat as I realized that I'd remembered to close the main garage doors and lock the door from the garage to the laundry room, but couldn't remember locking the man door from the garage to their backyard. I almost dropped the phone as someone began pounding on the interior door. Through the pounding, though, I could hear a voice. A really, really fucking familiar voice. Ma 49, Ma 49. It's Dad. Let me in. I stumbled over, completely numb, and unlocked the door. My dad could hardly stand up. He was laughing so hard. Apparently, my mom had sent him over anyway to check on me and make sure there was nothing to be afraid of. He'd done a quick sweep of the woods and backyard with a flashlight, under the assumption that Mom had mentioned he'd be coming over. He saw me through the window and attempted to show me it was him by pointing at me, and then shining the light on his face. Under his freaking face. He was unaware that the shadows made it impossible to tell who he was, until he saw the color drain from my face and realized he'd just given me the scare of my life. He thought it was pretty funny. I didn't really agree. I know that the ending kind of makes this story inappropriate for Let's Not Meet, but up until I heard my dad's voice I really thought I was about to get all kinds of murdered. Babysitting gets creepy. I began babysitting at 13 to earn extra money to spend on horribly embarrassing things like Fall Out Boy CDs. I would almost always work for my dad's clients, lawyers, and get referred by word of mouth. I was babysitting for this one family who had a little girl, 9, and a little boy, 7. The parents seemed okay, if a tad crotchety, giving me a full schedule to follow and jokingly threatening to beat any boy who might mysteriously show up after they left. It felt cruel for them to accuse me of even knowing a boy given I looked like an overgrown baby with frizzy hair at that age. Almost immediately after the parents leave, the little girl sings in a creepy high-pitched voice, "We're all Al 0001 now. Rightio? Cue the Shining soundtrack." I know. The little boy chimed in, "Let's play rape." Looking back now, I know the kid probably just heard the term on TV, knew the word was shocking, and said it just for a reaction. I bought into it at the time, sputtering wide-eyed and changing the subject quickly. These kids were hell for the next hour. I wouldn't let them watch South Park on the TV because their parents did not seem like the type to allow their precious 7 and 9-year-olds to watch a show like that. As soon as I said no, the little girl said casually, "Oh, that's fine. We'll just go play PlayStation in the family room. Feel free to watch it out here." Lol, nope. I knew exactly where that was headed. I said they could watch any other TV show in the living room while I made them dinner. The parents had left instructions to make them sandwiches. I could handle that. Before I had even got out the bread, I heard a massive crash. It seems like the little girl has broken a glass. Tutting and pissed, but ultimately with no way to punish her, I cleaned it up while these two incredibly weird kids watched with wide eyes. Dumping the broken glass in the trash, I went back to making the sandwiches. I'm a vegetarian, so while the kids had chicken, I made a simple salad for myself. Just as I was finishing, the little boy screamed out in what, even from my hyper-vigilant state as an accountable teenage babysitter, sounded like a pantomime of pain. Nonetheless, I ran over to the couch in the living room to check on him. "My ankle." He howled, dramatically flopping back onto the couch. While I tried to figure out how he had hurt his ankle, the little girl slipped out of the room. Peripherally, I was aware of this but didn't pay it any mind, focused on this little boy pretending to be in pain. He kept saying I went to stand but it hurt too much, I don't know, over and over until his eyes suddenly flicked to just behind me, where I could see the little girl standing with a perturbing smile on her face. He was miraculously healed. Yeah. Praise the Lord. At this point, I just thought these kids were really weird, craved attention a little too much, and probably needed more parental involvement. Whatever, I was 13, and that $60 was only 4 hours away. I set out the sandwiches for the two to eat at the dining table, went to get a soda, and returned. After pouring soda for the both of them, I realized they hadn't even taken a bite of their sandwiches yet. I asked them what they were waiting for. They smiled, For you to take a bite of yours. I am so glad I had a gut feeling to open the top part of the bread of my sandwich. Because when I did, I saw glass. Broken glass. Broken glass that I'd put in the trash. I stared in horror at the two little kids staring at me with menacing twin grins. I lost it, shouting, "Are you serious? At the very least, you could have injured my mouth. What's wrong with you two?" Instead of crying, or apologizing, or pretending to be ashamed or confused, these two little fuckers began laughing. Not like kids. It was too low, it wasn't that silly, free laugh kids laugh. It was low and threatening. I'll never forget that noise. My immediate reaction was these kids are too young to be laughing like that. I called my older sister, 17, at the time and cried about what had happened, and she came and took over for me. We left the house with chills after the parents arrived. I never babysat for those two again. What I can't get past is the level of premeditation that went into sprinkling that broken glass in my sandwich, and the remorseless way they responded to my getting upset. They were unlike any two kids I've ever met before. Babysitting sure is a hard job. Milo giggled as I chased after him, holding his blue pants in one hand and a fresh diaper in the other. He was butt naked and so energetic, I thought I'd never get him to sleep. But after an hour or so of wrestling, trying to get him to stay tucked in, I decided to put him in bed and shut the door, ignoring his laughing and yelling and stomping as I rubbed my tired eyes and slithered away back onto the couch. Finally, after 10 minutes, all was silent. I checked up and he was fast asleep, although sideways, he was in his little wooden bed. This family was definitely below average wage and their house was small but cozy. There was an entrance with a couch, a small TV, and a nice big window behind them. There was also a small kitchen, Milos's room, a bathroom, and the parents' room. Milo had spent most of the day playing in the backyard, which was just a thicket with no yard around it, but Mila didn't mind. I fell back down onto the black couch and shut my eyes for a bit, hoping his mom would be home soon. You see, Mila's mom, Mrs. Jenner, had gotten divorced from Milo's dad a few years back, and she had hired me as an extra helping hand since I had bonded with Milos well. Now, Mrs. Jenner was at the hospital, giving birth to Milo's little brother, with her new husband eagerly waiting. I could tell Milo hated his stepdad and I hoped he'd get along well with the new baby. I opened my eyes again and grabbed the TV remote. I clicked the on button and the screen turned on, seemingly as bright as the sun through the darkness of the house. I searched through the various apps until I found Netflix, and opened my profile. There was something strange though. It suggested multiple murder documentaries. I had never had any interest in them and never watched any on the job. So why were they showing up here? I found my favorite show, Brooklyn 99, and chose an episode. After 20 minutes or so, I got really tired and drifted off. I woke up at 2 a.m. to a slam on the window. It startled me awake, so I jumped up and dropped my phone as I flew to the other end of the room. My eyes were wide as saucers as I turned my head to face the big window in front of the TV. There it was. A man, standing in raggedy blue jeans and a black jacket, with a thick matted beard in his eyes. His eyes were a shade of green I'd only seen in one innocent little boy before. He had Milo's exact eye tone. I frantically looked for my phone but realized I had left it in front of the couch as it fell. I darted to pick it up, but just as I was dialing 911, I looked back up to see nothing. The yard was empty, the snow fresh in a thick blanket. I pressed call and shakily explained the situation. The next 15 minutes were pure torture, waiting for the officers to arrive, and wondering if I'd still be alive by the time they made it. But I was, and I saw the blue and red lights shining outside the front door. 3 officers, Michael, James, and DB, had come to help me. Wait. I wasn't the only one here. I jumped to my feet and felt sweat rush down my head as I sprinted toward little Milo's room. I had been so invested in my safety I had forgotten about the little boy I was supposed to protect. I slammed the little blue door, which had a sign reading Little Milo on it, open. Nothing. The bed was empty, with a fresh splatter of blood on the wall. The window was smashed. That must have been the thump I heard. But that didn't make any sense. The officers checked outside and saw no footprints in the snow, just an even blanket of tiny little snowflakes. It had not been snowing long or hard enough for this to be possible. There was only one reason for what I saw. He was not outside. It was his reflection from inside. How a nightmare saved me. Back when I was 16, I was asked to babysit my neighbor's 4-year-old daughter whom, for this post, I'll call Emily. I took him up on the offer given that my family and his family know each other relatively well, and the money they were offering was too much to turn down. His house was relatively big and had several bedrooms. I stayed in the guest bedroom upstairs while Emily stayed downstairs. One noticeable feature of the house is the rather large air ducts that ran throughout the house, of which some were large enough for a full-grown man to crawl through. My instructions were clear: entertain her, bedtime by 8:30, no horror movies, and nothing above a G rating. After watching Wall-E for what seemed like the 30th time, I ordered her to bed given that it was well past her bedtime. At that moment, I thought I could hear the sound of a screwdriver coming from the backyard. After putting her to bed, I got my phone flashlight and quickly ran around the house. Nothing. I crashed in bed and began wondering if I was just hearing things or even going insane. I could swear I could hear a screwdriver, and the sound of nails being unscrewed from something. At that moment I must have fallen asleep. That's when I had the strangest and scariest nightmare I'll probably experience in my life. It was just me, the house, and Emily. I had been pushed out of my bed in a way that I was standing upright. What made it even more bizarre was that there was absolutely nothing outside, except a white backdrop, and a very foggy and smoggy sun. Inside the house, everything was unnaturally dark and dusty. I began hearing Emily cry. I opened my door and began running down the stairs and hallway. It took me what felt like a full minute to get to her room. By the time I found her, she was back to playing with her toys. I picked her up and began walking out of her bedroom. Suddenly she began crying, but not in a normal way. Rather, she was crying the way a newborn would. She was screaming "Baga." She pointed back into her room. I looked and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Deep down though, I felt a sudden and overwhelming urge to run as fast as possible. I began running down the now 1-mile-long hallway. She screamed "Baga" and pointed to something behind me. I started to comprehend what she was saying. Bago? Bad God? No. Bad guy. I turned around. This time, something quickly ducked behind the door. I ran again as the sound of banging led me to turn around again. There was a full-grown, slender man running towards me at an inhuman-like speed. I didn't look back, but I felt his claws dig into my back end. I woke up. It was 3 in the morning and immediately after, I heard the same banging and crying I heard in my dreams. I ran down towards Emily's room. I grabbed my neighbor's baseball bat. I ran into her room and saw she was huddled in the corner. What's wrong? Baga? Wah. The bang answered that. I looked to the opposite end of her room, towards the vent. A hand was reaching out followed by the most unnatural and broken face imaginable. I took one swing with the bat. The person gave out the most horses, a witch-like scream one could imagine. That was my cue to run out with Emily in my arms and run as fast as possible to my other neighbor's house. Within less than a minute the police arrived just in time to catch the guy leaping out of the fully opened and unscrewed vent shaft in the backyard. They had him. It was all over. But even that didn't comfort me, not my family, not the fact that I practically neutralized him when I broke his one good hand with the bat. Nothing could take the words he said to me out of my head. Her hair tasted good. You're up next. I am never babysitting again. When I was in high school, I babysat for some families in my neighborhood to make some extra money. I was pretty close with the kids since I had been babysitting them for years. One night I got a text saying they were a friend of one of the families I babysit for. Let's call them Jane. Hey, it's Jane blank gave me your number, would you be able to babysit for a couple of hours Saturday night at 8? I agree and she gives me the address. Although they live pretty far, I stick to my word. Saturday night rolls around and I take a bus to get there. I live in a pretty small town and am familiar with most of the roads, but for some reason, this home was hard to find. I walk down the gravel driveway and am met with Jane, who had already been waiting for me at the door. I greeted her. The home was cold and dark but spacious, and the floorboards creaked under us while she showed me around and gave me clear instructions. No TV after 8:30. Claire is 9 now, so I expect her to follow instructions, but if you could make sure she's in bed before 9, that would be great. She led me into the kitchen to show me where the snacks were in case I got hungry. When we got into the kitchen, I spotted something in the corner of my eye. Something was peeking at me at the end of the corridor. I look over to see that it's a little girl wearing a red dress. That must be Claire, I say. Oh, you must be special, she rarely ever comes out of her room anymore. I glanced at the same spot again and the girl was gone. When the mother leaves, I walk up the stairs to say hi to Claire. Her door is locked, so I knock lightly. Soft classical music is playing, so I leave her alone for a while. I'm a very nosy person, so I took the opportunity to look around the old house. It was pretty big, there were so many hidden nooks and doors. After a while of exploring, I look at the time, it's 8:47, I should make sure Claire is getting ready for bed. I walk back up the stairs, but before I can get to the top, the little girl is sitting on the steps. It's bedtime, Claire, I say, but no response. She doesn't move or say anything. Then I hear the bedroom door open. Hi, you must be my new babysitter, says a girl wearing a purple PJ set. I look back down and the girl on the steps isn't there anymore. In complete confusion, I say, I think your sister is playing hide and seek. Claire looks at me confused and says, I don't have a sister. At this point I'm completely freaked out. I laugh it off, tuck her into bed, and go back downstairs. Jane didn't mention having another child either. Who was the little girl? At this point I must be going crazy. I watch some TV downstairs to clear my head. I put something random on, making sure it's on a low volume. Around 11:30 I heard crunching in the kitchen as if someone had been eating and cooking in the pantry. I expect that it's Claire, who has snuck out of her room for a late night snack. When I walk into the kitchen, the pantry door is open with a Chips Ahoy box on the floor with tons of crumbs. But no Claire. I find a broom in the corner and begin sweeping up the mess. Claire, no sneaking food, it's bedtime, I say. While sweeping the last few cookie bits, I hear a faint giggle behind me. I bolt around and see a trail of crumbs down the dark corridor, and at the end of the trail was the girl in the red dress. At this point, I knew I was not insane. She was standing a couple of meters away from me. Fuck this, I murmur. I slowly place the broom back in the corner. She's still standing there giggling from time to time, which felt like a fucking lifetime. After a few seconds, she turns and runs into the living room. I stay in the kitchen until the mom comes home, and I don't bother telling her anything. I need to get out of that house. She pays me and I bolt out of there so fast. I am never babysitting for her again. I was babysitting my cousins. Something was trying to take them. This happened when I was 15, babysitting for my cousins. My cousins were both girls and under the age of 10 at the time. Their house was in a wealthier suburb with big front and backyards, neighbors' houses a good distance away. The backyard ended by the edge of the woods. We spent most of the afternoon playing outside. When it was time to come in, the younger of the two girls was nowhere to be found. I sent the older ones inside and went to the edge of the yard where they were playing. I saw her back to me, frozen in place. I kept calling her name but she wouldn't answer. I stared where she was looking into the woods, seeing nothing but trees in the approaching twilight. Have you ever tried one of those magic eye posters? Where is a big messy pattern, but if you focus just right the image appears out of nowhere? That's what it was like. All of a sudden I was looking into the face of a stag. Something was wrong with it, it looked sick or injured or something. With loose patchy fur and a misshapen flat face. My father was a hunter and had occasionally pointed out deer that had illnesses that weren't worth taking. This reminded me of that. Fearing the animal was dangerous, I ushered the girl behind me as we backed away. Once far enough we turned and ran. I heard it move just within the tree line, loud snapping branches as it lurched forward. We got inside and I slammed the sliding glass door shut. Peering outside I couldn't see it at all. The night continued as normal until I heard a knock at the back door. Hello? Hey, is anyone home? We could use some help out here. I was confused. The girls knew the voice and explained it to their neighbor from across the street. I told them to wait in the living room. I looked out the back door to see someone standing there. He repeated those same words and I explained that we weren't allowed outside. I remember thinking he looked odd, like he couldn't stand upright. He shifted awkwardly on either leg. I kept telling him no and he kept repeating himself. Eventually, he just turned and walked off our porch, out of sight. I went and explained to my cousins that we couldn't open the door for anyone and that everything would be fine as long as we stayed put. About an hour later I became wary of a sound. It was a gentle but methodical sound slowly circling the home. Every door and window rattled slightly. I went into panic mode, making sure everything was locked tight. We stayed in the bedroom the rest of the evening, cowering in fear from the sounds outside. Eventually, there came a knock at the door, and their mother's voice called out. We all ran to the door, thankful for the night to be over. I hesitated at the door, thinking to myself, was strange she didn't let herself in. As I tentatively reached for the knob, a sound came from the kitchen. We all jumped at the jarring ring of the phone. I hurried and picked it up. We're running a bit late. Well, be home in 20 minutes. The voice of their mother came through. I can't remember if I said anything. We were all in shock. The parents arrived home within an hour. As far as I know, nothing else happened that night. The one thing I still remember was the pair of dark antlers left on the side of the porch. Babysitter. As a teenager in need of a job, I jumped at the opportunity my aunt presented me with, a job as a babysitter for a diplomat named Miss Milton who lived in a lavish house in the Canadian Embassy. The job seemed perfect, as Miss Milton lived alone with her baby, and the pay was good. However, from the moment I stepped foot into the house, I knew that something was not right. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and every shadow seemed to move on its own. But I ignored my unease and tried to focus on my job, which was to take care of Miss Milton's baby. At first, things seemed normal enough. The baby was sweet and easy to care for, and Miss Milton was pleasant enough when she was around. But as the days went on, I began to notice strange things happening around the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps coming from empty rooms. I tried to ignore these strange occurrences, but it soon became impossible. One night, I was putting the baby to bed when I heard a voice whisper my name. At first, I thought it was Miss Milton, but when I looked around, I realized that I was alone in the room. That was when I knew for sure that the house was haunted. I tried to tell Miss Milton about my experiences, but she brushed them off as my imagination. She said that the house was old and creaky and that I was just hearing things. But I knew that there was something more to it than that. The energy in the house was dark and foreboding, and I felt like something was watching me at all times. I tried to stay calm and continue doing my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. One night, as I was putting the baby to bed, I saw a figure in the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure, looming over me and the baby. I screamed and ran out of the room, clutching the baby tightly in my arms. Miss Milton was furious with me for disturbing her, but I didn't care. I knew that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The next day, I quit my job and never looked back. I was shocked when my aunt told me that Miss Milton was aware of the haunting in her house and that the ghost was her mother. According to my aunt, Miss Milton's mother had passed away a few months ago while she was in Canada attending her funeral. It seems that her mother had followed her back home and had taken up residence in the house, though Miss Milton insisted that her mother was just looking out for her grandson and meant no harm. But for me, the idea of living in a haunted house with a ghost that was watching over us was just too much to handle. Babysitting nightmare. It was a chilly October night. My friend Alexandria and I were both babysitting for our neighbor's children, the Doyles. Their parents were out for a dinner party with their company and wouldn't be home till late. This was fine for Alexandria and I. 31 days of Halloween were on and we had made hot apple cider for us and the kids to enjoy. It was a typical fall night until the doorbell rang. I got up, went to the door, and opened it. No one was there. I looked out into the night to see if I could spot any kids playing ding-dong ditch, but the street was empty. A little concerned, I shut the door and went back into the living room. 5 minutes passed and the doorbell rang again. I hustled to the door, hoping to catch the pranksters red-handed this time. I opened the door and again, no one was there. But this time, under the welcome mat, there was a note stuffed under it. I nervously picked up the note and read it. "You'll have to be quicker than that," the note said. "How about you check upstairs?" I turned around and saw a shadow disappear on the landing upstairs. My heart froze. No one was upstairs. Everyone was in the living room. I sprinted into the living room and dragged the kids and Alexandria out of the house. I showed her the note and told her I saw someone upstairs. We went to the next door neighbors, explained the situation, and called the police. When they finished the investigation, they informed us that they found duct tape, rope, and a steak knife in an upstairs bedroom. Also, one of the windows was forced open and damaged. The police told us we were lucky nothing happened to us. They have no idea how long the intruder was in the house. That piece of information haunts me still. The Doyles came home early and they ended up staying with family that night who lived about 20 minutes away. Alexandria and I went back to my house, but we never went to sleep. This all happened about 5 years ago. But still, on chilly fall nights, I always wonder, what if we didn't leave the house when we did? What if whoever was in the house actually did what they planned on doing? I'm just thankful to God that I'm still alive.